I'm Raymond. I'm 68 years old. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon in Chicago, and for 40 years, I have been a hardcore atheist. I didn't just disbelieve in God. I built my entire identity on that disbelief. It wasn't something I held loosely or privately. It was foundational. It was central to who I was. My career was rooted in strict materialism. Consciousness is the brain. The brain is meat. When meat dies, consciousness ends. That isn't belief. That's neuroscience. That's fact. I've spent 35 years in the operating room, thousands of surgeries. I understand the brain at a clinical level most people never reach. I understand how damage to specific brain regions disrupts consciousness, memory, personality, identity itself. I've studied it. I've used that knowledge in every surgery I've performed. I've operated on thousands of hearts, and I've understood precisely what happens to consciousness when the body fails. Brain death, flatline, and that was the end. Nothing after, nothing beyond, just the cessation of neural activity. I wasn't passive about my atheism either. I was hostile, active. When people would talk to me about their faith, about spiritual experiences, about God, I would listen with clinical detachment. I would explain the neuroscience. I would cite the research. I would be right, and they would be wrong. I had 40 years of certainty, and I was confident in my mission. People didn't usually argue with me. When you're a cardiothoracic surgeon with decades of experience, when you carry the authority of someone who has studied the brain, most people simply listen, and I could see in their eyes that I'd planted doubt. That was the goal, to replace their faith with reason. And then I died on the operating table. It was a routine procedure, the kind I'd performed thousands of times before. Everything was normal. The patient was stable. My team was sharp. I was completely fine, absolutely fine. And then something changed. Something went wrong in my own body. I felt it. That sensation you don't forget. A feeling like the floor beneath you is dropping away, like the center of your chest is collapsing inward. Ventricular fibrillation. My own heart was failing. The irony wasn't lost on me, even in that moment. A cardiothoracic surgeon dying of cardiac arrest while standing over the operating table. The universe has a cruel sense of humor. Within moments, I wasn't the surgeon anymore. I was the patient. My team was working on me. Their urgency, the blur of motion, the realization that I was losing consciousness. As the world was fading, as everything was going dark, the last thing I remember thinking wasn't peace. It was rage, pure, hot rage. Because I was dying, and I suddenly knew, with absolute certainty, that I had been completely, catastrophically, fundamentally wrong about something enormous. And then I was clinically dead. I was outside my body, looking down at myself on the operating table. People ask about this. They ask if I saw a tunnel, if there was light, if there was any classical near-death experience imagery. No. What I experienced was clarity, crystal clarity. I could see the surgical team working on me. I could see the monitors showing flatline. I could see my own body beneath the bright surgical lights. And here's what matters. I could see details that should have been impossible. The color of my shirt under my scrubs. My colleague's face on the other side of the table. The OR light from angles that would require me to be floating several feet above my body, suspended in space. I was observing from above, completely conscious, more aware than I'd ever been in my life. And the rage didn't fade. If anything, it intensified. Because I was conscious, I was thinking, I was perceiving. And according to everything I'd built my life on, that should have been absolutely impossible. The brain was flatlined. No neural activity. No consciousness should have been possible. And yet I was experiencing the most vivid consciousness I'd ever known. And then something became apparent to me. Something immense. I don't have adequate language for what it was. The easiest word is presence. The closest name is God. But it wasn't the God of religious imagination, not a bearded figure, not a distant creator, not a character from mythology. It was something far more fundamental, an intelligence. It was aware. It was aware of me, of my consciousness, of my being. It knew everything about me, every thought I'd ever had, every certainty I'd ever declared, every time I'd mocked someone for believing in something spiritual, every argument I'd made against God. It knew all of it, and it wasn't angry. That was what broke me open. I expected judgment. I expected condemnation. I expected the righteous anger of something divine, whose existence I'd spent 4 decades actively denying. Instead, what I encountered was patience, absolute patience. Like a teacher waiting for a student to understand something they've been refusing to see. The presence wasn't angry. It was patient. It was waiting. And it was about to show me why I was completely wrong. And then it began to show me the truth. Consciousness is not a byproduct of matter. That's what I got wrong. Consciousness is fundamental. More fundamental than the brain. Far more fundamental. The brain doesn't produce consciousness. The brain receives consciousness. The brain filters consciousness. Think of it this way. The brain is like a biological receiver. It takes consciousness, something that exists beyond physical matter, and translates it into something a biological organism can experience, perceive, and act within. This realization shattered everything, absolutely everything I believed about neuroscience. Listen, I understand brain function. I understand neurobiology at a deep level. When you damage a specific part of the brain, you disrupt consciousness. You disrupt memory. You disrupt personality. Damage the prefrontal cortex, and you change someone's entire personality. Damage the hippocampus, and you destroy memory formation. This is basic neurology. This is well-documented science. This is why I was so absolutely certain the brain produces consciousness. Because damage the brain, and you damage consciousness. The logic seemed irrefutable, but here's what I didn't understand. Here's what materialist neuroscience misses. Damage to a radio doesn't mean the broadcast stops existing. Damage to a radio means the radio can't receive the broadcast. The broadcast continues. The signal continues. But the receiver is broken. So the person with the broken radio hears nothing. They conclude the signal never existed. But the signal was always there. The radio was just broken. That's what I was being shown. What the presence was revealing. The brain is a receiver. Consciousness is the signal. Damage the brain, and you damage the ability to receive consciousness through your body. But you don't damage consciousness itself. Consciousness is unharmed. It continues. It transforms. The interface is broken, but the signal persists. And if consciousness is fundamental, if it exists beyond the brain, then it doesn't end when the brain dies. It transforms, it transitions, but it continues, it survives. That realization was devastating. It meant 40 years of certainty, 40 years of defiance, 40 years of building my identity on the absolute conviction that there was no God, no afterlife, no spiritual reality. All of it was wrong. Not partially wrong, catastrophically wrong. I had built my entire life on something that was backwards. I had spent 4 decades convincing people that consciousness dies, that there's nothing after, that love is just chemistry, that meaning is something we manufacture, and I had been completely, fundamentally wrong. I've never experienced anything more humbling. I pride myself on being intelligent, on understanding complex systems, on getting facts right. And I had gotten the most fundamental fact completely backward. I had lived my entire adult life as someone who was certain about something I was completely wrong about. But here's where it got strange. The presence showing me this intelligence I could only call God. It wasn't punishing me for being wrong. It wasn't condemning me for my 40 years of defiance and hostility. It was showing me something else. It was showing me why I had to go back, why I had been given this knowledge, why this death wasn't going to be the end for me. I was being shown that I had unfinished work, an unfinished mission. I had to return. I had to go back to consciousness filtered through a body. I had to return to Chicago, to the OR, to my patients, to my wife Elaine. I had a job to do, and that job was to use my credibility, the credibility I'd spent 40 years building by being so certain about materialism, to tell people the truth, to warn them, to tell them what I now knew with absolute certainty. Consciousness survives death. God exists, and they need to know this before they die thinking there's nothing on the other side. I realized something in that moment. The patience wasn't indulgence, it was strategic. I had spent 40 years convincing people there was no God. Now I had to spend whatever time I had left telling them I was wrong. That's when I felt it, a pull, a calling. Like Elaine, my wife, my partner for 40 years, reaching across the boundary between life and death. Like her love pulling me back. And I understood. The presence. Go back, tell them. Consciousness doesn't end. Consciousness is the foundation. They need to know. And I was moving, being pulled back toward the body, back toward life.